Welcome to the second video for your IGCSE English Literature prose section. This is Sredni Vashtar by Saki. Imagination is a very important part of this story, namely Conradin's imagination. He completely lives in his imagination. His imagination is presented as a world where there is freedom. This is compared to the empty world of reality. He lives almost entirely inside his imagination. The real world is ruled by adults such as his cousin, who he detests, and is incredibly cruel to him. So why wouldn't he live inside his imagination? The narrative style makes this world seem more desirable. In fact, it is what saves Conradin's life, and you can see this from the following quote. One of these days, Conradin supposed he would succumb to the mastering pressure of wearisome necessary things, such as illnesses and coddling restrictions and drawn-out dullness, without his imagination, which was rampant under the spur of loneliness. He would have succumbed long ago. So, without his imagination, he would have given up on life long ago. So we can read into this that it is his imagination that is keeping him going. Conradin seems to be a perfectly normal child who finds the cruel outside world difficult, and he uses his imagination to cope with this. However, what makes Conradin different from other children, very different from other children, is his almost pathological escape from reality, and the fact that he achieves his revenge through the ferret. Not many children, in fact, no children, would use their imagination to create a world where a world in which they hate an adult so much, and then use an animal or whatever to get their revenge on the adult. Yes, children often do imagine hating an adult and they imagine them dying, but they don't actually carry that through. What is usually only imaginary for children is actually carried out by Conradin. More disturbingly is that Conradin relishes it. He loves it. He relishes the fact that Mrs. de Ropp has been murdered. An essay question that you might like to think about is, how does Saki vividly convey adult cruelty in Sredni Vashtar? And for this, you should focus on the characterization of Mrs. de Ropp and the imagination of Conradin, and how Saki has used these two things to convey or to show adult cruelty. So, to some extent, Conradin could be seen as a typical boy. This is linked to what we were just talking about with imagination. He could be seen as a typical boy escaping inside his imagination from the cold, harsh world of adults. Lots of children do this. Sometimes normal children imagine killing their adult antagonists. But does he really expect her to die? Probably not. He could never imagine that Sredni Vashtar would be able to murder Mrs. de Ropp. Although he was wishing it, he never actually probably believed that that was going to happen. However, at the end of the story, it is his cold, calm acceptance of her murder when he's eaten buttering and eating toast at the end of the story that is so shocking in this story? Yes, he was probably asking Sredni Vashtar to murder her. Yes, he probably didn't expect it to happen, but when it does happen, he very calmly accepts this, and it is shocking and disturbing. So what is the horror in this story? Well, in some ways, Sredni Vashtar, the story, can be seen as a child's fantasy of getting even, getting his revenge against the non-understanding world of adults. And as a reader, we can empathize with this because we've probably all experienced some kind of cruelty as a child. So we can empathize with this. However, the horror of the story is that Saki presents it as reality. It moves from his imagination to reality, and that is what is so horrific. And the fact that Conradin is fully enjoying the event of Mrs. de Rop's demise or death, and this is a horrific thought. So you could define this story as macabre. Macabre means the quality of having a grim or ghastly atmosphere. Macabre stories emphasize the details and symbols of death. This is definitely a macabre story. What distinguishes Saki's stories is his ability to capture the feelings and attitudes of children towards their elders. How do you know that this story, Sredni Vashtar, is a macabre story? Have a think about this question. What details and symbols of death can you see in this story? So in the previous video, we talked a little bit about narrative viewpoint and Saki's purpose, and have a think about what his purpose is. What does he want to do with his story? His purpose in many of his stories is usually achieved by a quasi-objective narrative viewpoint. Quasi means almost, an almost objective narrative viewpoint. So objective would be omniscient, because we can see the sides of all characters. However, this story is more of a limited narration because it's not told as first-person narrator from Conradin, but it's very much focused on Conradin as a character, and we can see inside his head and we can see his thoughts and feelings. Not something that we can do with Mrs. de Rop. Often in Saki's stories, the narrator interprets events from the point of view of, and often it is a young protagonist. Remind yourself what protagonist means. Main character in a story who is the goodie, the good character. The opposite of that is the antagonist. So Saki often interprets events from the point of view of the young protagonist, but the narrator pretends to relate events objectively. But actually, the narrator is biased towards one character, and it makes us feel sympathy or empathy, or it makes us be on the side of the young protagonist. In this story, the narrator at the beginning shows the situation as Conradin sees it. To Conradin, Mrs. de Rop represents those 3/5 of the world, etc., etc. Remind yourself what that quote is. Saki takes the point takes the boy's point of view towards the annoying and mean cousin, Mrs. Durop, who, Commodin believes, takes great delight in tormenting him. Some themes from Sredni Vashtar. Clearly, cruelty and evil can be seen in this story. People have a great capacity for acting in evil ways in the world. And we can see this in both Commodin and his guardian, Mrs. Durop. Mrs. Durop treats Commodin very badly throughout the story. She's supposed to be his parent figure, the one who's looking after him, the one who's caring for him. But in fact, she delights in making him feel bad. She's pleased. She finds nothing better than making him feel bad. And she feels triumphant. She feels like she's a winner whenever she denies him something that he wants. Earlier in the story, it was the toast, because she thought that it was not an appropriate thing for a young boy to eat. You might want to link that with the ending of the story. On the other hand, Commodin can be seen as quite... his behaviour can be seen as quite bad because he wants such horrible revenge for Mrs. Durop. But does he really, or is it only in his imagination? Does he really expect this to happen? Maybe, maybe not. He does do rituals, though, with Sredni Vashtar, his ferret, to try to keep her toothache going. And he might pray for her death. But the cruelty can be seen when she is killed at the end and he is happy. But would you define this as cruelty? Or would you maybe think that he feels free? He's free from his tormentor, his abuser. So maybe actually this is not a representation of Commodin's cruelty. Maybe he's just happy that his abuser has died, which is very understandable. Some symbolism that we can see in this short story. Remember what symbolism is? Authors choose characters or objects in their story to represent something bigger. For example, black often represents or symbolizes death. A dove represents peace. Red can represent love or danger, etc. In this story, Commodin represents the oppressed and Mrs. Durop represents the oppressor. So the oppressed means somebody who is not allowed to do something, has little power. The oppressor is the person with the power. If you think about, for example, Britain and India, when Britain colonized India, Britain was the oppressor, India was the oppressed. The hooded hen might represent purity and hope and Commodin's innocence. And the fact that Mrs. Durop sold the hen makes this even more cruel. Sredni Vashtar might symbolize Commodin's anger and hatred towards Mrs. Durop. The shed might symbolize a cathedral for Commodin's religion. The religion is when he idolizes, when he treats Sredni Vashtar as his god. It's also a safe place for him. And the toast at the end of the story, when Commodin is eating the toast, this represents his freedom from his abuser.